Hello and welcome to the Weight Free Wellness Podcast. I'm your hostess and the creator of the Weight Free Wellness Podcast, Tara Bachland, and also the author of You-niversal Self-care, Improved Health Through Self-Understanding. We have some really great guests coming on, and I didn't plan this, but they all kind of happen to have something to do with gut health and the many branches that stem from the gut health. And I'd like to encourage you to visit us at weightfreewellness.com and subscribe to the newsletter. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, whatever modes of communication are your favorites to stay up to date, to know who's coming up next, and actually be able to ask questions ahead of time for these guests. And in the future, I'd like to do some live events as well, so you'll get the latest updates of those events. So today I have with us, her name is Jennifer Kozek. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I thought I was on a roll, and then I.
So that's what happens when you record.
Yes, it's live. We're live for us. I'm not editing that one. So she is Jennifer Kozek, the author of Healing Without Hurting, and a board-certified psychotherapist. She has a master's of science in counseling and extensive experience in private practice. She specializes in working with ADHD, depression, anxiety, OCD, and autism. I'm so happy that she's joining us today. Thank you for joining us, Jen.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. And, your book is so chock full of, I think it would be I think it's actually something that every parent should read even before becoming a parent. There's such a solid foundation of understanding of the connection between our gut health, of course, but a number of other factors.
Right.
So, I'm getting ahead of myself. Would you share with us, I briefly read your background, but what goes into being a psychotherapist? Maybe explain to us what's the difference even between a psychotherapist or a psychologist, psychiatrist. That might help too.
Okay, sure. Yeah, a licensed counselor or a therapist, psychotherapist. We have a master's degree in counseling or whatever field. I took a concentration in clinical, which means that I can treat one-on-one for different disorders. A psychologist is often somebody with a PhD that goes on to do more research-based, and sometimes they also treat. It's just, a little bit more schooling. And then a psychiatrist is who prescribes medication. And back in the day, many, many years ago, the pharmaceutical companies, kind of came on board. And since then, most psychiatrists only do medication management, although some more old school psychiatrists will actually do some therapy alongside their practices. So I traditionally was working with psychiatrists, either in a hospital setting or a private practice setting for years and years, probably about 10 to 12 years. I worked primarily with those doctors. And I had no knowledge or education about anything alternative medicine, which has actually been around more than allopathic medicine has, although it's starting to make a comeback, thank goodness. I had no knowledge that there were other things that we could be doing that could be treating our patients, ourselves, our kids. So I always just thought medication was the best route of care. And so being that I was trained in the medical model, my mom was a nurse. I grew up, basically learning about healthy eating and stuff through my grandparents who were traditionally Italian and German. It's interesting because now I can look back and I remember getting the education about herbs, about eating healthy food, and all of those things from them because, processed food and stuff sort of just kind of came online around the time when I was a young kid. But my grandparents remembered what it was like to actually eat whole food and would always encourage my parents to cook that way. And so I sort of in the background of my mind always had a belief system, and I've always thought myself to be a little bit more holistic and just minded. And so when I would ask the doctors, well, what about thyroid condition? Could cause anxiety? They'll just shrug their shoulders and just prescribe a med. And so, traditionally I was working with them. And then since having my own son who was on the autism spectrum and my daughter with anxiety and finding so many wonderful ways of treating them without meds, that were not chemicals. You know, a lot of these kids already have too much toxic burden as it is. And so we then just add more chemicals to the toxic burden. And the toxic burden is actually causing some of the symptoms. So it sort of becomes a vicious circle.
There's so much to it. And I think you really break it down really nicely in the book, you know, like piece it apart and make it really comprehensible. And what I remember from the book too is that you were working with kids in your practice.
Yes. I mean, I worked primarily with adults, but I did have, even before treating my own children, I did have some, especially teenagers. I seem to have a lot of teenagers, and a lot of them were being medicated, and I would find that symptoms were getting worse, not better, or they'd have a side effect to the med, like they weren't sleeping, and then the psychiatrist would just give them another med on top of the med that they were already on. And so it just became, you know, a vicious circle. And the kids weren't really getting better. We were just sort of medicating symptoms, and maybe some of the symptoms were disappearing, but then other things would show up. And I would try to do traditional therapy alongside, and sometimes it was helpful, but it wasn't as helpful as it could have been. And so, you know, I started questioning all of it, you know, when I had my own children.
So let's jump into your story, because that's really where a lot of it begins.
All right.
Go for it.
So my son was born 32 weeks, so he was premature. He was in the NICU for about 6 weeks. And, you know, little did I know that the reason he was actually in the NICU is because he had an undeveloped digestive system. That's exactly what the doctor said to me. And at the time, I did not know that meant immune system. No idea that the gut meant immune system. So he was there on artificial nutrition. He was not getting any good gut bacteria. He was artificially fed. He couldn't digest breast milk, even though I was producing it for a good 3 to 4 weeks, which left his gut completely sterile. So, you know, very, very early on, and I also gave him a Hep B vaccine in the NICU because, you know, very even-tempered neonatal intensive care doctor told me that the risks were high and the benefits outweighed the risks, and so I believed him. And so, you know, we did all of the mainstream things that you do in a NICU. Now I know what I know. Europe is actually light years ahead of us in what they do with their children in the NICU, but that's a whole nother discussion. But we started to notice pretty early on that he was not developing like typical children. He had hypotonia, which was this very rigid kind of stance as a child. He had very low muscle tone. He had birth to 3 services pretty much from the time he was 1 week old. We had occupational therapists and physical therapists working with him because they could see that his motor skills weren't developing in the way that even a 2-month-old was supposed to develop. He never crawled. He didn't meet a lot of his milestones. And when that happens, there's a lot of neurons that are not firing correctly and are not integrating. So because of that, he had a lot of sensory issues. You know, later on, he was 2 and 3 years old. He was flapping his hands. He didn't like to touch the grass because it hurt. He had a lot of sensory to, you know, oral motor sensory. He wasn't really speaking. He was babbling, but I didn't realize that he was supposed to be babbling with syllables. And he would just say da, 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 da. And, you know, being a new mom, I thought that was babbling. You know, he was chronically sick as a child, ear infections, chronic croup infection, you know, bronchial infections. I couldn't keep this kid well. And the pediatrician just kept telling me, oh, he's fine. He's a premature baby. He'll never develop, you know, he'll always be a little behind his peers when it comes to his immune system. Well, that was really bad advice. And so, you know, he was kind of going through life, and, you know, it was clear to me that he was not typical. Although I did not want to admit that he was on the autism spectrum, even though my aunt and my mother-in-law and all the people in my life were like, yeah, I think you should have him evaluated. And I was like, no, he's just behind because he was a premature baby. And the pediatrician kind of kept that line going for quite some time. So all this time, like, he wasn't getting all the services he could have probably. And, you know, and as things just developed, we just noticed more and more that, you know, he had speech apraxia was his first diagnosis. He didn't walk until he was 2.5 years old. He, you know, cognitively, he was, you know, kind of spacing out, and he would have like these space out episodes, which we thought could possibly be a seizure disorder. But no one was sort of putting the pieces together. And the doctors kept telling me, well, you know, by the time he gets to school, he'll probably need some kind of stimulant medication for ADD. And, you know, basically, this is it. Sorry, don't know what to else to tell you or how to help. And, I'm really sorry, all moms go through this, but, you'll be okay. You'll get to an acceptance phase. And that was what they did. So basically there was no hope for my kid. There was nothing I could do to help him. And that was pretty much how they left me. And that's, and with that information.
I must have been really, you do explain in the book where it was difficult, even going to birthday parties and gatherings with friends and compare. You can't help but compare, right? The other kids are making their milestones. And then I'm sure on top of it, coming from your education background, wanting to believe in the medical model and believing in what the doctors say, but it seems like there was just, if not your mother-in-law and your aunt, there is still that gut instinct also saying, gosh, something's just not right.
Yes, and I knew, but I didn't want to say it because if I said it, then it would be true. It's that the denial. It works really, it really helps cope for a time period, but then you really have to start acting. Because denial just kind of kept me not doing anything else about it. I was just kind of going through the motions. Until my aunt sent me an article about malabsorption in children with apraxia and children with autism spectrum disorders. And it just opened my eyes to what the possibility that there was something I was going to be able to do to help him.
And at that time, you were still working. You were going to all these appointments with him. Yeah. And so I think you mentioned it took even maybe a month or two to get to that article. First of all, being in denial, probably not even wanting to look at it, let alone read it. But you found a way to make the time and to do that. Right.
And when I did, I couldn't stop learning. And it was at that point that I basically got 35 books on the subject. Everything from Dr. Bach's book, Healing New Childhood Epidemics. So many books out there actually were starting to come up, articles on the internet. I just started pulling down scientific medical journals that the ones that the doctors apparently weren't reading. There was so much literature coming out about the brain-gut connection, about microbiomes in the body and how that helps to regulate our immune system. And all of these things just started adding up. And it amazes me because to this day, I still get so much resistance like, oh, this is all pseudoscience. This is science. Like there are actual researchers out there actually studying these things. And unfortunately, it's nothing that are in the books of the pharmaceutical companies because they don't want us to know. They just don't want us to know it. It's easier to just give them, it makes a lot more money to make us sick than to make us well. They have a lot of customers. They prefer it that way. And it's really up to the parents to fight back and to say, nope, you know what? I'm going to look for the root cause of these issues because this isn't black and white. This isn't my child has a genetic disorder and there's nothing we can do for it. And so, everyone in my family has ADHD. I hear that a lot. And I said, well, probably everyone in your family has food sensitivities and gut issues that goes generation to generation because no one stopped to actually heal it. So is there a genetic piece to this? Absolutely. Like anything else, but we're turning on and off our genes like never before. We're realizing in the field of epigenetics that we're actually have more control over our genes than we might have previously thought.
Absolutely. And there's so much more coming out, which is really exciting. And if you're the scientific type or like to read all that stuff, it is out there. I love focusing on the stories like this. And I love that you have both. You have the science behind it and you have the story, because you can't really argue with a story where you can say definitively beforehand, your son, Evan, was like this, and tell us some of the progress, what you went through to help treat and heal.
Yeah, well, I think, I was very fortunate in that my first stop was to a naturopath that understood gut health, because that's really the pivotal moment of change. So we did a food sensitivity test, which revealed that he had numerous sensitivities to numerous foods, including gluten, dairy, egg, mustard, cranberries, and a couple other things, which told us that something was going on in his immune system. He was overreacting to the food. What was interesting, though, is when I took him to a traditional allergist, they told me he didn't have celiac disease, so he was totally fine. They did a battery of, allergy tests, which just basically tests for your skin's reaction to. He came back nothing except like dust mites, and they were dead wrong. If I would have just stopped there, we would have gotten nowhere. But the naturopath said, oh no, we're going to test the IgG sensitivities. We're going to go deeper to figure out if there's an if the antibodies in your body are reacting to the food. So we found that he was sensitive to all these different foods. We pulled them all 100% from his diet. I remember the last regular pizza he ever ate. And since that day, there was never turning back. My husband agrees, like that was the fundamental thing that changed his life. Dairy and gluten happened to be one of the biggest aggravators of inflammation, which was causing inflammation in his brain. We had to reduce inflammation. So that was big. We did a lot of gut healing remedies. And because we started to do that, we also started to take a look at our pantry and realizing all the toxic food that we were eating. I look back at home videos of things we were giving these kids, and I cannot even believe that I was so blind to all these chemicals, but most of us are. Who would even care? Like, if I didn't have a kid like this, I wouldn't have been paying attention.
Right. It's sold at the grocery store, so it must be food, right?
It must be food because it's on the store shelves.
Right.
When you start looking at the ingredients label, you realize the amount of pesticides in all of our produce. You start to realize how many neurotoxic chemicals. When you start examining each of those ingredients one by one and looking them up, they cause everything from hyperactivity to cancer. Unbelievable.
I think one of the best examples that you list in your book, and I'm not going to name the infant formula. You name it in your book, but I'm not so brave here.
Right.
Infant formula, you name and you list all the ingredients.
Yes.
Most of them you can't really read anyways. So it's kind of just going by the rule. If you can read the ingredients and you understand firsthand what they are, then it's probably real food. Mm-hmm. But this formula, which you were, I don't know if it's the same one that you were prescribed to give to Evan as an infant, but you, in hindsight, you said this wasn't food.
Right. No, it was cornstarch, which is genetically modified. And it's interesting because in the formula, there's like 5 different ingredients, which if you look up equals sugar. So most of what's in these formulas are sugar. And then on top of sugar, you have MSG and other harmful preservatives and genetically modified corn. And very, very dangerous for especially a newly developing baby. And, a lot of kids now go on soy formula. Soy is a hormone disruptor. It's an anti-mineral, which means it basically leaches all of your important brain minerals right out of your body. And parents they don't know. They don't realize that what they're feeding their infant is poison, basically. So my book does talk about like alternatives and things like that. And it's interesting because he was a NICU baby and I was encouraged to breastfeed. I did breastfeed him to the very end as far as I could, and I did not give him any formula, although they wanted me to because of his low birth weight, but I refused. So I knew something even back then. I refused it, but I didn't realize that the state of my breast milk was probably not up to par. I had, probably issues in my childhood where I didn't get good gut bacteria either. I was a premature baby. I was a C-section baby as well. I took birth control pills for 15 years without realizing that it completely destroys your gut bacteria. So although it was prenatal care I was getting, I realize now, and that's why, I think it's chapter 28 of my book, talks all about what I should have done before I conceived and, all of the things I could have done to actually prepare myself for healthier breast milk. I was very toxic. I did testing afterwards. I had cadmium in my body and lead in my body. And, what doctor's telling you, well, before you conceive and actually to increase your chances of conception, get off all genetically modified foods and detox yourself. That would have been a good idea. We don't realize how many of our toxins that we're all carrying around, we just pass through the placenta of our unborn child, giving them lots of toxins without even, realizing it.
Many, yes.
Many.
One of the topics I'd like to get to later, which is preconception care. So about what age then did you start changing Evan's diet?
So he was about 4.5 years old when we got the official diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. And I'd say probably about 6 months later is when I got that letter from my aunt. She was persistent, man. She was writing to me every day, was sending me emails. She's one of those family members that we all could identify with. She was such a pain, but she actually got me to the right place. So probably around 5 years old, I remember it was probably the December before his March birthday that we started the diet. So it was right before he turned 5. And we started this by pulling everything. And I remember kind of crying that day, like, what am I going to feed this kid? Like, he only ate like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on wheat bread. Like, that was his staple. I look back and I never really realized like how picky he was. I just figured it was just a kid. We used to give him chicken nuggets and French fries and, the kid menu of food. And I never realized, just how much of that stuff I was actually giving him. And, on top of it, I didn't realize that he was, he had a little bit of a picky thing going on. I didn't, he used to pull the cheese off his pizza. And I look back at that and I think, oh, of course he did. He had a high sensitivity to dairy. Like, I was like poisoning the poor child with macaroni and cheese, and he would push the macaroni and cheese away. And I'd be like, what kid pushes macaroni and cheese away? What's interesting with these kids is that they either crave it, they crave the food that they're most sensitive to, or they push it away, one or the other. And for Evan, he was definitely one that pushed things away. And I would try to like force feed him. I'm like, you have to eat, And afterwards, I felt so terrible. Like, here I was, and all of a sudden, I started giving him like vegan cheese or different things to eat and whole food, much different. And all of a sudden, he started eating because his gut was feeling better. He was feeling much, much healthier. He didn't have a stomach ache. When we did this whole treatment on my daughter, because she had rage issues when I gave her dairy. And I remember the day she turned to me and said, Mom, I didn't know my stomach wasn't supposed to hurt. I was like, wow, here are these kids that got put on formula or whatever, and they have really bad diets. They have a chronic stomach ache. They can't even, they don't know any better. They just think that that's normal to actually, and a lot of these children, they have constipation issues, or they complain of belly aches after they eat, or they have really dark circles under their eyes. I look back at pictures of my kids and I'm like, wow, now I could spot them across the room. I'm like, yep, food sensitivity, probably, because bright red ears is a huge indication of some kind of food sensitivity. And so when you start recognizing these things and you start putting that into practice, you realize like anything else would be literally poisoning them. And that's kind of how I was able to move forward with this, because it wasn't easy. But I thought, wow, to him, if I give him ice cream, it's poison to him. Lucky for some people that could probably eat it and be fine. Not him, not my daughter either. And it's hard. It's hard at birthday parties. I have to pre-plan, and my son's going to a sleepover party this weekend, and I have to plan the dinner and the breakfast, and, it's difficult, but it's necessary, Well,
especially when you see the positive results, and even there are people who are not aware. There's the non-celiac gluten sensitivity where yes. Being aware on a whole new level, but it is a blessing in disguise. You talked about Evan before we started recording. You talked about Evan being really in tune with his body now, not just earlier when he was taking the cheese off his pizza.
Right.
That doesn't mean that they're picky. It can mean that they're really in tune. And there's something to say about being sensitive in your gut to being just an overall sensitive person. Doesn't mean a weakness. It can actually be a blessing in disguise.
Right. And I find that a lot of children now, if you want to speak spiritually about them, they do have a spiritual higher awareness. They're operating out of a completely different sensory perception place, and that they makes them much, much, much more sensitive to environmental stimuli, to toxins, to certain foods. And so we're doing them a great injustice by not letting them tune into their bodies and in healing them. And sometimes it takes a little nudging, because especially if they're used to just eating not so well, and then you start introducing healthier foods, it's a struggle at first. They're not going to be happy with you. But,
you said there wasn't so much a craving aspect. What was there, a die-off of yeast? I'm assuming there's a yeast issue or candida. How was the transition? What would you say to parents who are going through the transition of changing the diet? How to live?
Well, it depends. And this is where it's interesting, where every child is unique, and that it's not one size fits all. So some children have very high yeast, and that's their main thing that they have to fix. They eat way too much sugar. They have a lot of yeast in their gut. For Evan, they weren't actually as concerned about yeast, although they found some. We all have some. But what happened was when we cleaned up the diet, all of a sudden that just went away on its own. For other children, they need a severe yeast protocol. They may need to take, garlic tablets, for 6 months or whatever the doctors would recommend. But it is a little challenging because with recovery is a process. Recovery doesn't happen overnight. And so what we would see is progress, backswing. And I'd be like, oh crap, what are we doing? Like, this isn't working. And then it would be like bad day. Oh, there's the good day. And we'd move forward. And so especially when we're doing any type of detoxing or any type of yeast die-off protocol or whatever we're doing, we're going to assume that there's going to be some backslides. The other thing that we find is that once we pull the foods and the kids are healthier for it, we notice if they do get anything of that type, their bodies are even more sensitive than they were before. So I'll notice sometimes, like if the kids came home and they're in a really bad mood, I'm like, what did you eat? It could have been like a popsicle. I don't know what, maybe a little too much sugar. But they're very, very sensitive. And maybe because we're so in tune with it and we just don't chalk it up to a bad day. And sometimes that's all it is too. But we're very much in tune with, what did you have today? And Evan will be like, oh, they gave out blue ice pops at school. And I'm like, oh, right. So we know for him, dyes, food dyes are made with petroleum and coal tar. Like, we don't feed it at home. Once in a while we're at a circus or something or whatever, maybe if we're at a festival or something, maybe. But I like that they get like this much. I just don't want them to have an eating disorder one day. The therapist to me is like, oh no, we don't want to go too crazy with this. So
that's a very good point.
I have to be honest, there's actually some cheats here and there, but I think cheats are important for some kids on certain things. Like, I can't let them cheat on ice cream.
How do you let them? So 2 questions.
Yeah.
How do you manage when they're not at home?
Yeah.
And how do you it's the air quotes, control, Is that real? And then what are the cheats?
Yeah. So how we how we deal with it outside of the house is, one, we always make the lunches for school. So because 99% of what's in the school cafeteria in the United States of America is not healthy at all. And so that makes that easy. And it's easy to say to the school, yeah, my kids can't eat that because they have food sensitivities. So that makes that easy. I actually have to get a letter written from the naturopath saying, yes, indeed, they have these sensitivities. Don't feed them anything. And so when there's some special event at school, the teachers know enough to contact me and I bring in the alternative. So if they're having an ice cream party, I bring in the coconut ice cream for them. So it's more planning. It's a little annoying sometimes because a birthday party will get sprung on you in the last minute and you have to make a cupcake. So what I decided to do is actually, if I have to, I'll make gluten-free, dairy-free, egg-free cupcakes. They're actually delicious. And I'll put them in the school freezer with their name on it. And they know that if there's a birthday party that springs up and we're not prepared, there's always a snack. So, that's part of it. As far as controlling what the kids do, right now the kids are 9 and almost 11, and they still listen to me. And they also know that, they're so educated, they educate other children about different foods. And so I'm very lucky that I have compliant children because I know that's not realistic for everyone. So my kids actually, listen to what I say, and they'll come home and say, Mom, I got, a bag of Skittles from someone's birthday, but I only ate 3 and I threw the rest in the garbage. I'm like, okay. I don't make a big deal of it. I don't whatever. I feel like, we've gone to a birthday party actually where there was actually just a traditional store-bought cake, and Elena took a bite of it. And I was like, go ahead. And she took 1 bite. She goes, oh, this tastes like chemicals. I'm like, that's why we don't eat this kind of cake. And so they need to know. They need to make that decision on their own on some level.
Is that part of the psychotherapy where you help to prevent the eating disorder issues, where it becomes, as age appropriate, you let them experiment and taste the difference and make the decisions on their own?
Yeah, I think it's very important because we want them to say, I'm not eating this Pringle because I choose not to eat it, not because my mother makes me do it, because I'm on this special diet, no, because that's going to just, I think, create the opposite effect. And so like they had to bring in a Pringles can for an art assignment or something at school. And so we went to the gas station because we don't have Pringles. and we dumped most of them out, and I gave each of them a Pringle. I said, here, try these. And my daughter took one bite and threw it in the garbage. She goes, that's gross. And my son was like, oh, this isn't bad, but I like my, I like my seaweed snacks better. And I was like, oh, right. Well, that's why so, they have to, so now when they're at a party and they see a Pringle, they're not going to like crave it or want it. It's like they know it. And if they wanted to eat one, they can eat one. So when I talk about like cheating, they both know what happens to them because we've actually gone on vacation. Last year we went on vacation and they told us there was sheep cheese. So they were going to make gluten-free pizza with sheep cheese. Sheep cheese actually from Italy doesn't affect them. So some kids, cow dairy is really, not so good. Sheep cheese from Italy, better for you. So they can have it in moderation without a reaction. So we were so happy that there was going to be sheep cheese on vacation. So they made us a pizza 2 days in a row for lunch. It was gluten-free pizza crust and sheep cheese. Well, my children, it was one of those very embarrassing moments at the pool when you have to like take them by their bathing suit tops and bring them because they're making a complete scene. Mm-hmm. My daughter was like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know what's wrong with me. My stomach hurts. And she's freaking out. Brought her into the room. I told my husband, go check out the kitchen. Go back there and find out what was in that cheese. Dairy. It was cow dairy with maybe this much sheep cheese, and they called it Manchenko. It wasn't 100% Manchenko. My daughter turns to me and goes, oh, that's why I don't eat it. I said, right. I'm very happy that happened because she was starting to question whether or not, do I need to do this forever? Maybe I could start eating cheese again. Well, we got our answer. And she was miserable for like 3 days. She had a stomach ache. Like she missed part of the vacation because she really felt sick. And so, in a way, I was kind of glad that happened,
But what's interesting, even you sharing that, is I'm thinking of all the adults that are listening going, I've had really painful digestion, or I had that as a kid. Actually, I would get off the bus in the morning, I would run to the bathroom. And if the teacher had known, this is for parents and teachers out there too, if a kid is just agonizing or they look like they're in pain or they're raising their hand to go to the bathroom a lot, there really could be something else going on, and your body is a terrific teacher.
Yep, absolutely.
Trust it. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about the stages, the progression that Evan made. Once you started with the diet, what other kind of treatments were you integrating there? Because there are quite a few.
Yeah, it's a lot. So you have to start small because otherwise you get very overwhelmed. But we ended up addressing the nutritional levels because when you have a leaky gut or you have gut issues going on, which we spent a lot of time talking about, what happens is the vitamins, even if you're taking multivitamins and even if they're really high quality or you're eating healthy, the body can't absorb the nutrients that well. So some children, also can't process protein that well. They have no digestive juices or not enough. And so sometimes you need digestive enzymes. And so the whole name of the game is to get the nutritional levels up the best you can. And sometimes you have to use synthetic vitamins in the meantime, and so you can get the diet better. And sometimes children have genetic mutations, but then you need to increase the doses of certain vitamins. But overall, so nutritional deficiencies are really at the root of all of these disorders. And then we just need to look at, well, why? Do they have a food sensitivity that's also creating havoc? Are they eating foods that have neurotoxic chemicals that are causing hyperactivity or whatever? So we would go through the stages, and one by one we started addressing neurotransmitter levels and amino acids. Now, amino acids actually help the body to make neurotransmitters. Some of these kids have very low neurotransmitter levels, and it's probably because their body either doesn't process protein well or they have a terrible diet and not eating enough protein. So as we started to do this, I'd say probably within the first 30 days, we would notice tremendous difference in him as far as his ability to communicate, and his brain fog was like lifting. All of a sudden he was communicating with us. His speech apraxia was still an issue, but like he like the light bulb went on. It's like he was here. And and as we were going through these things, they were talking about Evan needing an electronic device to write a sentence because they didn't think that he had the motor skills to do that. And by the end of kindergarten, which was about a year into our treatment, there was no longer a need for that device. He had made much more progress than just the therapy alone. We were kind of going at a snail's pace. He was making progress, but as soon as we started introducing some of these things, the the progress just started to catapult. And again, it wasn't like perfect straight line. Like we had backslides from here time to time. But, his anxiety levels were down. He started to sleep through the night, which was like a novelty. From 18 months old, he was not. He was making more attempts at social interaction with friends. He had more energy, more get up and go. He had, we didn't know, but he had very low cortisol levels. So we needed to help with some herbal medicine and, to support the adrenal glands. And so for every kid, it's different. And so that's why there needs to be sort of an investigation, a metabolic workup to try to figure out for this child, what needs to happen. Is it heavy metal toxicity? Is it a yeast problem? Is it a nutritional deficiency? So what we do is we just start simple. We just start pulling foods like red dye, number 40, and all the processed foods. Just start getting rid of them. That's a lot of the foundation of the Feingold diet, is just taking out the chemicals. See if there's a difference. For some children, that's it. They don't need to be on their ADHD medication if they don't eat red lollipops anymore. I wish it was that simple for us, but it is that simple for some kids. For others, that helped, but we still have some anger. That helped, but we still have a sleep problem. Then we start looking further. Food sensitivities would be one of the first things that I'd look at. Secondly, third would be nutritional deficiency levels. What are what's the vitamin mineral levels, And then what I found out, once we went through all of that, and he was making a lot of progress, but still had some social deficits and some learning disabilities, we started to do therapies like neurofeedback, brain balance therapy, brain gym with a good OT or PT, because it's almost like the brain has a little bit of damage. And so now what you have to do, even though you reduce the inflammation and the damage is healing, you have to sort of now put the brain back on the track for some of these kids. So sometimes, we've done everything. We have done craniosacral therapy, which is amazing energy work. We've taken them to a shaman. We've addressed almost anything we can throw at it. We have, and sometimes we go, that was a big waste of money. And for him, and then other times we go, wow, that was really profound. We put him on a cranial sacral table for the first time when he was about 8 months old, and it was the first time he rolled over. And then I kind of put it on the back shelf, and then when we started to do all this alternative stuff again, I said, oh my goodness, we need to take him back there. He seemed to be very receptive to that. And so we do. We take him for monthly tune-ups with the cranial sacral therapist.
And is there something we would at this point suggest for all newborns, even with birth trauma and so forth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even there are some chiropractors that only work with children. I mean, unbelievable. Kids with colic, cranial sacral is a very gentle, very, very, very gentle. I mean, I know some people kind of get scared with chiropractors, although if you go to a really good one, they're not going to snap their neck or anything. It's a very light manipulation down their spine to sort of open up all the brain fluid and everything in the body, and align, and make them aligned. But then the cranial sacral also phenomenal. I mean, Evan had a wry neck, so he had a neck like this, and then he had a flat head, probably from being in the NICU. And they wanted to put a pediatric helmet on him. And now every time I see somebody in a pediatric helmet, I just want to go up to them and say, no. It's so antiquated. Go to a cranial sacral therapist. Within weeks of being with a cranial sacral therapist, the head shape was normal.
Do you think that could help with, I've read about babies who are put in these seats all the time?
Yes.
It's a flat spot. Will the cranial sacral help with that as well?
It absolutely helps with that. It helps with kids that are colicky, kids with temper tantrum issues from very, very young. I mean, it's so important to get these other, modalities on board. And insurance is slowly starting to cover some of these things. And I've noticed too that a lot of practitioners will also be OTs or occupational therapists. So very often the insurance will cover them because they're a chiropractor or because they're OT or PT. And whatever they do in their session is all helpful. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of alternative type therapies that you may not hear about from your pediatrician that have absolutely been monumental in helping Evan kind of get over the next hump.
But it seems
So,
like once you get in that network too, like you share in the book, that even meeting this naturopath was kind of serendipitous. Your husband through someone new at work whose wife had just started, and you just kind of said, okay. But it opens the doors to so many other practitioners as well. Like, just try. It's encouragement just to try.
Yep. And you have to follow your gut, because not everyone's created equal. Again, it's like any doctor. It's like if you go to a naturopath and all they want you to do is just take a whole boatload of supplements, but they haven't done one test on you, or run far, far away. Everyone, some are very, very schooled in homeopathy, which is fantastic medicine. Some have no education in it whatsoever. I always thought all those things were interchangeable terms, but apparently not. So every doctor has their specialty. I mean, we have seen a naturopathic physician that only deals with the neurotransmitter piece of it and the nutritional piece of it. And then while the other naturopath just addressed the gut health stuff. So just like any other doctor you would see, sometimes you need a team of doctors or practitioners for your child, because you get to a plateau, and that's when you say to yourself, maybe we need to go in a slightly different direction here, and move towards something else.
So what would you recommend for people who maybe don't have that great of insurance, or even, I try not to get too political on this podcast, but, with changes always imminent in healthcare, what would you suggest to someone who maybe doesn't have insurance that covers all these things? And maybe even what we can do to just be aware of what down the road. Well,
a lot of things. First of all, a lot of doctors will work with you with sliding scale and things like that. So don't be just as scared by a price tag, because what they often charge the insurance companies may not be what they charge you if you don't have the insurance and so forth. So a lot of good physicians will work with you, or know a colleague that might be learning. And so they're always good people to go to. I mean, there's a lot of, around here, I'm fortunate we have a couple naturopathic, universities. And so there's actually a clinic that's run by newer. And actually, my naturopath was a newer naturopath when I started with her, and I kind of taught her some things, and she sort of taught me a lot. And so don't be scared to look, try to figure out what are the things you can do. A lot of the therapies could be expensive too. Sometimes a lot of the exercises that you can do with these kids, like even integrating their reflexes, there's YouTube videos. You could actually do some of this at home. I mean, yes, it's easier to go to somewhere. It's easier to have someone else do it with your own child. But sometimes you could actually, there was like brain balance therapy, which was really, really helpful. A lot of it was just vestibular exercises that we would do with him. And when I look on YouTube, if you Google brain balance therapy video, you will see moms doing some of these exercises with their children online. So you can actually access those anytime. Join support groups on Facebook. There's so many. My Healing ADHD and Asperger's Without Hurting is my book page and my page, but I got tons of information for free. And then also there's tons of support groups. I'm actually an admin in a group called, Non-ADHD Strategies for Non-Medication of Children Facebook group, support group. So there's tons of moms out there too that will teach you a whole lot. And so you can do some of it at home. Especially in your, there's lots of ways that you can, change the diet, do some of these things at home in your own kitchen. Some of it is nutritional, and you could do a lot of it. And then, if there's still symptoms, then it's, you really need to seek out doctors. Some pediatricians are more open-minded. Osteopathic MDs are all about this and very often covered by insurance. Functional medicine doctors and integrative medical doctors, some because they don't get the reimbursement that they probably deserve. Some of them choose to be out of network, but again, it's all relative. So you could probably find a practitioner that is an MD, because sometimes too, it's like in a family, like you might have the mom that's really open-minded to naturopaths, and then the dad that says, oh no, we're going to see an MD only. So integrative physicians, functional medicine doctors, they are going to cost more unless your insurance picks them up just because of their schooling. They're medical doctors with probably 4 more years of nutritional education and beyond. So they actually have many more years of training than even a regular MD.
Really good advice, and even change even some of my perspective. You think that someone who's been doing, let's say, naturopathy for 20 years, you assume that they're better, and they will be in certain areas, but there's something to say about the new person too. They might have a certain gung-ho-ness about learn about this subject.
Mm-hmm. And they might be more up on certain topics that, like gut biomes and gut health. That's just kind of a newer thing, unless an older naturopath is really involved in all of that. I mean, somebody says, well, do they have to specialize in autism or ADHD? And not necessarily. Autism is an autoimmune disorder. So if most naturopaths treat autoimmune disorders, so they would just treat this like an autoimmune disorder. They wouldn't necessarily need to put it in a box and call it anything. I mean, if you have arthritis or anything like that, they're going to say, no gluten. That's like going to be the first thing they're going to say. But, so autoimmune disorders, anybody that's treating autoimmune disorders, sometimes if you go to a fancy Dan doctor to treat autism now, sometimes there's a big heavy price tag on them because they see autism children. But there's a lot of other practitioners that are also doing the same work. They're just not, maybe they're treating other autoimmune disorders also. And so they're not, only an autism specialist. If they work with autoimmune disorders, they can handle this. If they're a practitioner that sees children, that's a plus, just because they know the temperament and they know how to work with families on dietary changes and so forth. But yeah, so don't be scared to look outside the box with that either.
That's really interesting that you point out that autism is an autoimmune disorder. I don't think that's commonly known, and that's going to be quoted.
It's actually an autoimmune, metabolic, and digestive disorder.
Okay, that's going to be...
Yeah, somewhere in the book I mentioned that. It's actually framed out by the American Pediatric Association of Naturopathic Medicine, I think. Came up with that. So, yeah, it's basically an autoimmune disorder.
You've listed some of them, but maybe if we can synopsize to kind of wrap someone's head around this. You've mentioned diet, obviously, is a huge factor, and that any story that I've heard, diet is the main thing. Right. You also mentioned something interesting in the book that, was it all or almost all kids who are diagnosed with some kind of autism spectrum disorder are blood type A?
Yeah, a lot. Well, A and O.
A and O.
A and O. And I talk about A in the book, but it's also O. Yeah, A type blood, and of course, both my children, myself, and my husband are type A. But we have a much more sensitive constitution. We do better with like plant-based diets. So we don't digest protein as well. We're bigger candidates for things like digestive enzymes because we don't break it down. We don't break down fats well either. Fats are so important for brain health. And so if we're not breaking down, it's a metabolic problem. It's somewhat genetic. It's partly on your blood type. I mean, there's lots of reasons for a genetic issue. Metabolic issue. And, genetic mutations also play into that as well. So there are certain genetic mutations that prevent the body from metabolizing certain things. But yeah, it's interesting when you start researching. I mentioned the blood typing just because that's an avenue in which some people like to go. We never fully followed that diet, eating for your blood type. But there is definitely something to be said for it.
Well, definitely a corollary too was, from what I remember from the book, blood type A is more plant-based, they digest plant-based foods a lot better, but then you still need the proteins. You need to be able to digest the proteins, like you said, to get the neurotransmitters going. In the body.
And there's lots of plant-based proteins. So like both of my kids, every morning they do a plant-based protein organic smoothie of some kind. Because I know they're probably going to utilize, their body likes plant food nutrition better. So, if we eat a steak or a hamburger or whatever, I'll probably, I usually will give them a digestive enzyme to help the body break it down. Ground meat is better for these kids because it's not as hard on their digestive system. So like if you eat chicken, if you eat ground chicken, it's better for them. If you eat steak, hamburger is better because it's already sort of broken down. It's, it's in smaller pieces, getting the kids to chew a lot. My family, we eat too fast. So that's a problem in itself. We're not
every family does that.
We're all like, so that's part of the problem too, is the food doesn't get broken down and we just sort of eliminate it before it has a chance to actually help us.
Yeah.
So
we talked about diet, blood type. We've touched on genetics, which is a whole big topic. It's in your book as well. I mean, there's so many factors to that, but I don't want people to sound afraid. Like this is a lot.
No.
It's actually quite fascinating too. My husband and I have had our genetic testing done, and even reading through your book, I was going back to 23andMe and looking up certain factors, certain variants, and it's really interesting. It's not all set in stone, but there are definite correlatives.
Right.
Another one that you hint on, but I think you carefully kind of tread around it, is vaccines.
Yes. I was more careful then than I am probably now. So if I was to write the book now, I'd probably have more to say, only because we get backed up by fantastic documentaries. Vaccine Revealed has just been released, Vaxxed. So there's more and more evidence coming out. And so that book was written 2 years ago. So now when I rewrite the book, there will definitely be more references to these types of, documentaries and so forth. I mean, so much more is coming out about this, but why I mentioned the Hep B vaccine in the NICU is that my son, Hep B isn't even a childhood illness. And, the fact that we're injecting these toxins into a newborn baby with really no safety studies that would ever suggest that was a good idea, that's the problem. There's never been one safety study done, and pharmaceutical companies have complete immunity. So you take that two together, what does that tell you? Really? They have complete immunity. If there is any money going out vaccine court, it's paid by the taxpayer. So, again, I don't like to get political either on these things, but I think maybe one of the changes that we will begin to see is a little bit of a roundup on the pharmaceutical companies and how much power and how much influence that they have even in the science. The science is being, the studies are being conducted by the pharmaceutical companies. Like, there's a fundamental problem with that. We need independent studies done from vaxxed children and unvaxxed children. And until that happens, you can't tell me that didn't contribute to Evans disorders. Because in the vaccine insert, it will say, for example, if you actually look at the small details, it will say vaccines could cause autoimmune disorder. It could cause seizure disorder. It could cause neurodevelopmental disorder. Well, hello, what are we talking about? But they won't say autism. Hello, or will cause intestinal distress and gut, blah, blah, blah.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're talking about. So when they say, they know it does. They know it does. And the Vax movie also comes out to say about the cover up in the CDC and how the movie talks about the vaccine industry, the GMO industry, the food industry. The food industry and the pharmaceutical industry is like this. There's no incentive to get us well. There's no incentive to feed us well. There's way too much money to be made. And so we just have to start thinking about this more critically. And although, there's major controversy and lots of people don't want to see the truth, I personally believe that it definitely contributes. And in my book, I talk about the vaccine insults. It's one of many. Why do we have life-threatening food allergies today that we've never seen? I mean, I don't remember anyone dying of a peanut allergy when we were young. When we look at asthma on the increase, we look at childhood cancer on the increase, we look at autism on the increase, like, this is not imaginary, like, this is happening. And so something has happened, whether it be our food, whether it be our air, whether it be the vaccines, whether it be the too many antibiotics, whether it be all the pesticides. The pesticides are killing all of our good gut bugs. Pesticides kill bugs. What our intestinal system is made up of? Bugs, and that regulates our whole immune system. So you can't tell me that putting pesticides into our body isn't doing something, and maybe setting them up for a reaction to a vaccine. So again, is it the vaccine? Is it the food? Is it because we all have autoimmune disorders? Basically, some of them are kind of underlying and maybe not as obvious. And maybe for some children, they're being born with sort of an autoimmune disorder underneath, and then we're vaccinating them, and that's what's just lighting the fire.
It's definitely worth looking into. I suggest, I'm really careful about especially telling parents what to do, but yes, being educated, it doesn't hurt to at least investigate. Then you can make a really informed decision.
Right.
What is it that you've seen? So I want to get into prevention, but I'm curious about this too, because you've seen young adults and adults in your clinical practice as well. What happens if these conditions are not treated? What kind of people, what does it develop into?
Well, the problem is that the kids don't really recover. So we have a generation, an epidemic, really. I mean, what's going to happen to these children? I mean, some of them are definitely higher functioning, and they'll probably get a job as an electrical engineer somewhere and just really not have many friends, and they'll be fine. And then there's a whole generation of children now that can't be in social situations at all, or banging their head against the floor, or completely dysfunctional, or have mental illness. I mean, the list goes on. So who's going to take care of these children when they get older? Like, there's no, we're already starting to run into that. Kids in their 20s and 30s that have to still live with their parents. What happens when the parents pass away? We have a huge problem on our hands. They say 1 out of 50 or 1 out of 45 boys now have autism. And they're predicting that if we don't get a handle on what causes it and how to prevent it, and also how to take care of it and treat it, we're talking about 1 and 2 children by 2026. That is, what are we doing? And so, prevention is definitely something we have to look at. We also have to look at causation. And some people say, well, we don't want to look at that because that means we have to look at the vaccines. But sometimes unless we do, we don't know how to treat. It's important too to know what the assault was, so that we can kind of help eliminate the assault, so that we could do all these treatments and spend all this money getting these kids better. And then we insult the system again by giving them too many antibiotics or whatever. So, when we look at, prenatal care, and I wish I knew now what I knew then. I mean, I wish I knew then what I knew now. I didn't know I had the MTHFR gene mutation, which 65% of us carry, which means that I don't metabolize folic acid at all. And it's actually detrimental to me. I was encouraged by my pediatrician, my OBGYN, to give, 800 milligrams of folic acid. That's what's recommended for every pregnant woman. 65% of us should not be taking it. We should be taking folate instead. And folate prevents birth defects. So I didn't know. Who tells you these things?
What's the difference?
So the folate is actually, B9 or B12. So it's the inability to process B12, B9. Folic acid is actually the synthetic form of folate. It's synthetic. And the body doesn't process it and doesn't utilize it the way it's supposed to. So they say, folic acid is the number one way to avoid birth defects. But if the body has a mutation and can't break it down or can't utilize the folic acid, we're basically not getting the folate that we need. So we need methylated B vitamins. We need methylated folate. We need methylated B12. And we should be told this, when we get pregnant. We should be told, don't take synthetic vitamins. Take whole food vitamins. Your body recognizes it as food. All these synthetic pharmaceutical prenatal vitamins are all junk. And if you look at it, the minerals are sourced from very bad sources. There's lots of chemicals, and there's lots of harmful things in these vitamins, and they're not going to help your baby. And so, we need to get away from synthetic vitamins as much as possible. Whole food vitamins, especially when you're pregnant, is much, 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 much better for you. All parents should be detoxed before conception. That would would help a whole lot. Mothers should be looked at for autoimmune disorders before pregnancy and try to get those under control, either with diet or whatever, because there's studies now that show that moms with autoimmune disorders have a much, much higher chance of having a child with autism. And that would make sense, because you're just passing your bad immunity on to your child, and then they get vaccinated or whatever happens, and then it's just the loaded gun that gets fired off. And so there's so many things, more minerals. Nobody told you, minerals are the most important. They help us to detox. They actually help the brain develop in so many ways. And we're so mineral deficient today because of all of our soils being totally depleted of every good nutrient. And so, magnesium deficiency, I had 2 premature children. Magnesium deficiency is one of the leading causes of preterm labor. I didn't know this until years later, and I got tested. I was dangerously low in magnesium. It's amazing that I was able to carry my kids as long as I did, because statistically I should have miscarried both of them. And so, these are all the things that, genetically modified foods, like testing on they did so many testing on mice with genetically modified foods, but by the third and fourth generation, they're sterile and they can't have children and can't conceive at all. So we need to look at, all these women that are taking all these fertility drugs, which have side effects. Could it just be getting off genetically modified food? Could that make the difference for their, for them being able to get pregnant? So, we're light years behind as far as prenatal. There's lots of things we could do to help safeguard against these issues, but nobody's teaching us these things.
And it's almost like our bodies are reacting to what we're doing to the earth, to the planet, which is ultimately affecting ourselves. It's like being affected on a personal level and having to realize not only are our practices hurting the earth, but it comes around to affect us eventually. That any kind of plant, if you starve it of nutrition, it's not going to produce healthy seed or seed at all. And or especially if we're eating, that's the ironic thing, if we're eating plants that are actually not meant to reproduce, you are what you eat in that sense. And I say these things over and over again on the podcast. I hope it doesn't get boring, but it amazes me how many times these things show up for us. And I believe we can reverse it. We can help heal our bodies from this. And what I thought was interesting that I gathered too from your book, talking about the baby is actually forming its gut, its internal biome from the amniotic fluid. And so the baby should be born with a certain amount, and it will continue to develop through the breast milk and so forth. But what's interesting to me is it sounds like so much is dependent on the mother's health.
Right. Yes. And I thought I was healthy. I didn't eat McDonald's every day. I didn't smoke or eat tuna fish like they tell you not to eat tuna fish. I didn't do any of those things. And so I didn't know that how deficient I was in nutrients, that I had a brewing autoimmune disorder with my thyroid. Because when I went to a regular doctor, my thyroid was fine. It wasn't fine when I went to the naturopath. She was like, this isn't fine. I was like, oh, they have a totally different way of looking at the same test results. And the baby gets, especially for all these C-section births now, they're at a much disadvantage because when the baby goes through birth canals, when they actually take a gulp of the flora of the uterus, and that's what helps to populate their gut. It's like a little seed that's planted in the gut to start, and then it builds on itself. And when a baby goes a C-section baby and no probiotics or anything is introduced, their guts are sterile. They have very little, except for what's in the environment. They're not getting the immune system that they need to be developing at that point.
And this may be a little bit much for some listeners, but I've heard of this term. I forget the doctor's name who came up with it, but the perineum picnic. So if for whatever reason you do have to have a cesarean birth, that you can essentially take the picnic, you can say, from the birth canal, take those fluids, and you can. I've heard some people, I'm sorry if this was too much for someone to listen to, but you can rub it on it's important in their eyes and their mucous membranes as well, but especially the mouth. And it's going to seems so weird to some people. Let that just settle in a little bit. But it's absolutely true. I mean, natural birth, and that's why so many people are choosing more natural births and stuff, because they do those kinds of things. The midwives know that that's important. They also know it's important not to clamp too early. That's another thing. Our obstetrics practices today are very, Western medicine. I mean, the 2 seconds after the baby's born, we clamp the umbilical cord and cut it. And, midwives and other people that practice more holistically know to keep the baby close to the mother for at least a half an hour connected to the cord. Because I guess what happens is the immune cells leave, from the placenta, go right through the cord, and it takes about a half an hour for all those immune cells to come back into the baby like a vacuum. And so all of these C-section births too, of course, you're trying to save your baby's life and whisk them into the NICU. So, I mean, I can't really blame my doctors for not doing that. But, even, regular births and stuff, leave the baby as the baby is. Don't
there's no reason to cut immediately. And if anything, that's another way to try to help safeguard against problems. You want them to have all their immune cells. And I did not know, because I decided to bank my immune cells for cord blood banking. Well, I didn't realize that they have to collect within a couple of minutes. And so what happens is you're giving it to the lab to put away, and you're not giving it to your baby. I wish I knew that. I thought, on one hand, I'm glad I banked, because now we have cord blood, for maybe, God forbid, a Parkinson's diagnosis or something later on, and they can maybe use this cord blood. But wow, didn't know. And I also didn't know that you could actually do adult stem cells where, even if the person has Parkinson's, you can actually get the stem cells from the person. You can go in and do almost like a spinal tap and get some of those baby cells anyway. So you don't necessarily have to do it when they're an infant, although they say that, their initial cells are the best cells and everything. But I didn't know by doing that, I was actually maybe preventing my own children from getting their immunity back. So, live and learn.
Well, the blessing is too that you are sharing this with anyone and everyone that you can reach. And yes. I really totally appreciate guests like you who come on and are so willing to share your story, especially and even when you can say, I wish I had known this, that you're not getting down on yourself, but you're putting that out there to hopefully help someone else. And that's definitely the point of this whole podcast.
Yeah.
And so appreciate you being willing to share all the ups and downs. There's much more. We were only hitting some highlights.
Yeah, no, but it's good.
If this piques anyone's interest, whether they feel that their child is not hitting those milestones or something's just a little bit off, or if you're planning a family, absolutely look into these things, not expecting that your child will have these issues, but to prevent these issues. Because I think it like we kind of hinted on, it helps even our society. If we can all be healthier. One of my favorite nutritionists I followed early on is Sally Fallon in Nourishing Traditions. And she talks about how in not even ancient cultures, but even just a couple hundred years ago, or even 100 years ago, certain cultures would have certain foods that they would feed their before conception. And that's not just 6 months before conception, but a couple of years at least before conception, to nourish the body, to make sure that everything is primed and ready to bring on the next generation. Because I'm even seeing and hearing much more the connection, even if someone just has anxiety, like you mentioned even about your daughter. How many people are experiencing anxiety and depression around us, and how does that affect us as a community? And so even, thank goodness your aunt did speak up. Yeah, we do all have those family members, someone who just is always in our ear, but they have a role, they're the herald of our cultures. So,
right, no, exactly. And it's interesting because my aunt's on Facebook, and sometimes I'll get a testimonial from somebody that will say, oh my God, your book saved my child's life. And I always tag my aunt in it. So I'm like, well, you started this. That's sweet. So I said, yeah, she certainly did. So yeah, the book, healing, people like the title, Healing Without Hurting, was actually, the title actually came from a cranial sacral therapist who thought of the title. And I said, I thought it was perfect. It was a perfect title for the book.
It absolutely is. Well, are there any closing messages before we tell people how to get a hold of you and so forth?
Yeah, I think just never give up. And the most important thing is to just really trust your gut. There are so many times I wish I would have trusted my gut. I knew better. I knew I should have done this, and I didn't listen to myself. And, and it's all, it's hard work, but a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So even if just today, it just planted enough of a seed to say, you know what, I'm going to start reading labels. I'm going to start paying attention to what I'm feeding my family. And I'm going to start cooking a few nights a week and planning more meals, because I realize, we're eating too much processed food. Even that, even if you did, it's 5% of what's in my book, but even if you did that, it would be, it would start the ball rolling for you to start. And then when you see the differences, then all of a sudden you start building on that. Because all of this information could be just way too overwhelming. It sort of has to sink in, digest. It might take you 2 months before you go, oh, I think I remember Jen on that podcast. I think this is what she was talking about. So that's okay. And just be patient with yourself, and just make the time for yourself and your family, because you're worth it. I think we get way overwhelmed with everyone else's problems and everyone else's issues. Like we forget ourselves. And ourselves, when we start treating our kids, we start to realize, wow, how bad have I been treating myself? And all of a sudden, like, I'm gluten-free now. I mean, I feel so much better. I'm off of Zoloft. I lost like 20 pounds. Like, it's not only just, it's a family affair. When the whole family can get on board, everyone is healthier and happier for it.
Sounds like great advice. It was so interesting. I love language, and it comes back to, you've said a number of times, trust your gut. Mm-hmm. It's about gut health.
I know.
Language. Yeah, or it takes a while to digest this, but just let it settle. Right. There's so many beautiful corollaries here. It's really amazing. Right. Yeah. So I am impressed. You have a beautiful offerings, really helpful offerings on your website, that if this seems like a bit much for people, your book is so thorough. I think is a wonderful way to get started for people especially. But if someone feels like that's just way too much for me, or I have to get started, you actually do have some ways that people can do that with you.
Yes, absolutely. So on my website, which is www.healingwithouthurting.com, there's links to my book, of course, which would probably be the easiest way to access my 3,000 hours of work or more. But then I also do question and answer sessions with people. If you just want to talk to me for an hour about some of the symptoms that your child's having, I can kind of point you in the right direction. I have more extensive coaching where I can kind of take you through the whole thing. Some people need that. Some people are so overwhelmed and just rather me like find the physician for them, do everything but basically feed them. So that's fine. I can help with that. And I also have a new offering on my website, which is a 3-hour workshop that I actually do with families and other therapists. And it's 3 hours, and you can stream it, and then you could watch it anytime you want. And right now, I think I have an offering. I think it ends up being $39.99 or something like that. With lowercase first 20 is the coupon code. So if anyone's listening to this, I know I haven't gotten 20 yet. I just put it up there actually after recording my last speaking engagement. So that would be a really easy way, if you didn't want to read the book or didn't have time, it'd be a really easy way to kind of get a lot of this information that way.
I wanted to end with one more thing. You told me before we started recording what Evan wants to be when he gets older.
He wants to be a kid doctor, he says, like Dr. Scaron, who happens to be one of his first naturopathic physicians. And, he's always asking me to do reflexology on his feet. I'm not a reflexologist, but we look up stuff on YouTube. YouTube's fantastic. You can almost self-teach yourself how to be almost anything. So, if I'm like, oh, you have a stomach ache? Oh, let's go on there and try to figure out what meridian points we have to press. And, and it always works, always. So, he's very in tune with all of that, and he really wants to help other kids just like him. So, and he tells me all the time, he goes, Mom, I know you wrote the book, but, I really wrote it.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that.
Yes.
I've so thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Thank you to you and your family for obviously putting this all together. I'm sure it's helped many already and will help many more.
Thank you so much.
You have a wonderful afternoon.
You too.